interview with Benny Morris, a historian known for his document-driven approach to understanding 1948 and its aftermath. He's the author of The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War, and Righteous Victims. And he explains why he trusts contemporaneous written sources over later memory when reconstructing what happened. You can read more about Benny Morris on our blog, 6degrees.blog, or our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy this interview.
And then I'll edit in an intro and everything, so I'm not gonna say it right now, I'll just edit that in. Um, what's one claim about 1948 that you think both mainstream Israeli and mainstream Palestinian narratives still get wrong or oversimplify?
What do they get wrong?
Hmm.
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what they get wrong. Um, Neither side really appreciates thinking about 1948, the other side's perspective.
Hmm. When you reconstruct what happened in a specific town or village in 1948, what kinds of sources do you trust most, and what kinds tend to distort reality?
Well, I basically trust written sources, in other words, documents from 1948 about each event, certain events, about what happened in certain places, and so on. I don't really trust oral testimony. In other words, what people think they remember from then, or if people 1948 today would be, I don't know, 90 years old or whatever. So I definitely don't trust their memories, which are usually memories constructed of perhaps real things they remember, but in addition to that, layers of um, um, collective collective memory, which is not real memory, but what their people think happened in a certain place, and propaganda and books they've read and things they've heard from other people. Their real memories of something which happened 70 years ago are really unreliable, certainly in terms of detail. They don't remember detail for sure. But usually, often they don't remember the general things as well.
Hmm. What's a conclusion you reach reluctantly, where the documents push you somewhere you didn't expect to go?
No, I haven't found that. If I had very strong prejudices, I'd probably say I was occasionally surprised and reluctant to go somewhere. But since I don't have great prejudices, I sort of approached the documentation I read, American, Israeli, British, United Nations, etc. And I, on purpose, leave out Arab documentation because it doesn't exist. There may be Arab documentation in Arab archives, but they're all closed. They're not open to researchers from anywhere, not Israelis, not Arabs, not Americans. You can't go to Arab archives about 1948 or 1967 or 1973. They just don't open their archives, and I don't know what exists there. There may be good documentation, there may not be. Nobody's seen it. Um, so I'm saying you go to documentation and you try and see if you can find documents from a number of sources about a certain thing, and then work out what, taken together, they're actually saying.
Hmm.
Not to try and rely on one particular document or on documents from one particular side or archive, but to try and get as much as you can from various sources.
Mhm. So could you give a sort of step line by line recount of what do you think has happened from 1948 to now, sort of briefly, possible?
Why don't you ask me for a history of the world in 2 sentences? It's not possible. I mean, we've
Okay.
had a struggle. There's been since 19, well, the struggle began in the 1880s. It didn't begin in 1948. The origin of what has happened is not 1948, it's 1880s, 1890s. That's when the conflict begins.
Hmm.
50 years before 1948. It's true that 1948 is a milestone in that things happened there which changed things. The major thing which happened in 1948 was a war between the Jews and the Arabs in Palestine, a civil war, which was followed by an Arab invasion by the countries around, which led to a war between Israel, the emergent state of Israel, and the Arab states around who attacked it. And so you have this war, and at the same time, you've got the state of Israel coming into existence in 1948. It was established in May 1948. So that's a crucial fact. And from there, lots of things follow. The Arab states don't like the state of Israel having emerged, having defeated them. They want to get rid of the state of Israel. The Palestinians certainly don't want the state of Israel to exist, especially as many hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were uprooted from their homes as a result of that war. So that problem of the Arab states' antagonism towards this new state of Israel, a Jewish state in the middle of an Arab-Muslim area, has continued down to this day. I'll talk about that in a second. And the second thing is that the Palestinian people, as they emerged eventually, they weren't actually called Palestinians at the time, but later they came to be known as the Palestinian Arabs, suffered a terrible collapse. And the main expression of that collapse was 700,000 of them, in other words, 2/3 of the Arabs who lived in Palestine, 700,000 out of 1.2 million, lost their homes and were pushed out, were pushed to the West Bank, were pushed to the Gaza Strip, were pushed out of Palestine altogether to Lebanon, Syria, etc. And they want to come back. That is, their descendants, most of those from 48, of course, are dead by now. But their descendants, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, retain this memory, or at least this passed over memory, that they want to return to their original lands and homes. And that refugee problem is a major sticking point, a major obstacle to any peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. What happened with the Arab states, over time, the Arab states, most of them came to understand that there was a new reality. There was a strong state of Israel established. The state of Israel beat them in a succession of wars, 1948, 1956, 1967, 1973, 1982. Those are the wars, the main wars. They lost in these wars. And so they sort of gradually resigned themselves to the existence of Israel, and some of them made peace with Israel, led by Egypt in 1979, followed by Jordan in 1994, and then followed in what's called the Abraham Accords, in which a number of other Arab states, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, normalized relations with Israel, meaning they established relations, diplomatic relations with Israel, tourism relations, economic relations, and sort of came to live with the existence of a state of Israel. They resigned to themselves to it. I'm not saying that those who made peace with Israel or those who signed these normalization agreements with Israel came to love Israel. They don't, but they say this is the way it is. I'd say partly because Israel is so strong, and so strong means they think Israel has nuclear weapons. That's one of the major components. People don't talk about it, but they understand they keep going to war with Israel. Ultimately, even if Israel begins to lose, they have nuclear weapons, so you can't beat them. That's the sense, I think, which underlies the Arab resignation to Israel's existence. Now, that doesn't mean that all Arab states have resigned themselves to Israel's existence. Syria hasn't made peace with Israel. Other states haven't so far made peace with Israel. But generally, the Arab states and the regimes which lead them have agreed to accept Israel's existence and have relations of some sort with Israel.
So what do you think will happen in the future, or do you not predict things like that?
I don't know. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future. Unfortunately, it looks like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that is the clash over the land itself between the Palestinian inhabitants and those who became refugees, but still are connected to that land in emotional, psychological, other ways, familial relations. They haven't resigned themselves to Israel's existence and continue to struggle against Israel's existence, inflaming, if you like, relations between Israel and the Arab states and many people outside this area. You see it in college campuses and other places. There's a big eruption of violence here. Lots of Arabs are killed in the violence, even if the Arabs begin the war, like happened in Gaza in 2023. But lots of people abroad have come to identify with the Palestinians because it's true that the Palestinians have suffered long as a result of this war. As I say, many became refugees. Israel occupied Palestinian lands or lands which are inhabited by Palestinians since 1967, had periodic clashes with Palestinians who lived in the Gaza Strip in the West Bank. And this continues to inflame relations between the Arab world and Israel, and especially the Palestinians in Israel and Israel, and also, as I say, around the world. Also, a lot of people sympathize with the Palestinians because they have suffered greatly as a result of this conflict. Yeah.
Mm. So what do you think could be done to make the whole, I don't know, situation better in terms of PR or actual
No, no, it's not a matter
policy?
of PR. It's a matter of psychology. You have to, well, ideally, there should be two states here, one for the Palestinians and one for the Israelis.
Oh.
This was what was proposed in 1937 by the Peel Commission while the British were ruling Palestine. In 1947, when the British were ruling here, the United Nations issued a resolution, came out with a resolution, the General Assembly, calling for a two-state solution. And there have been a number of offers since then by Israel's Prime Minister Barak and President Clinton of America, by Israeli Prime Minister Olmert, for two-state solutions. In other words, Israel would vacate the West Bank, vacate the Gaza Strip, vacate East Jerusalem, and a Palestinian state would come into being there, which lived side by side with Israel, recognized Israel in the rest of Palestine. This hasn't happened so far for two reasons, I would say. The main reason is that Palestinians, as I say, wanted to continue the struggle, refused to agree to a two-state solution, didn't want peace with Israel, simply wanted Israel destroyed, eliminated, and take over the rest of Palestine, all of it for themselves. That's one reason. The other reason is that the Israelis also gradually came to resist the two-state idea. They said, well, if the Palestinians want to fight us all the time, we also will say we want all of Palestine for ourselves, all of the land of Israel for ourselves. And that voice in Israel has been growing steadily since 1967. Arab terrorism, attacks by the Hamas, etc., turn Israelis into hardliners who don't want the Palestinians to have a state next to Israel because they don't trust it. They don't believe it'll happen. And they have a settlement movement which settles Jews in the West Bank and originally in the Gaza Strip as well. These settlements seem to say to the Arabs, well, Israel doesn't really want peace. It talks peace, but it's busy settling Jews in the West Bank, and they take up more and more land in the West Bank, meaning there's less and less land left for a Palestinian Arab state, should it ever come into being, which shows that the Israelis don't really want peace. So I'm saying there's two reasons for this inability to reach an agreement. One is Palestinian rejectionism. They reject the existence of the state of Israel and reject the two-state solution, partition of the land between the two peoples. They reject this. And there's the Jews who've become, many of them have become right-wing, anti-Palestinian in the sense of rejecting Palestinian statehood and this settlement enterprise, which takes up more and more land for the Jews, which potentially would be Palestinian land.
Mm. So in terms of current public policy, this is less historic. So Donald Trump obviously just went into Venezuela and took Maduro, and now they're going to take over for the time being. And I saw
Well, I don't know if he's going to take over. He's managed to capture Maduro and his wife. What will happen in Venezuela, we don't know
no, they
now.
they said they're planning on running it though.
Yeah, yeah, but I don't know how you run it for Washington without anybody on the ground
Yeah.
in
That's
Venezuela.
Yeah, definitely. I'm moving out to work in the Senate for the next 6 months, so we'll see. So I'm going to be living in DC from the end of January to June, so it's going to be super interesting over there. But
Right.
that's a little pause. And then um so I saw all over Twitter, obviously a lot of people who are very big fans of Israel, a lot of very Israeli people say, "Oh, Iran should be free within with soon now." What do you have any sort of opinion on what do you think would happen? Or I'm Iranian myself.
Iranian. I don't,
Yeah.
I don't know. It looks like the Iranian regime is very strong. It has quite a bit of popular support, though less and less. Apparently, most Iranians probably by now would like to get rid of these priests who run the country.
Hmm.
They run it with an iron fist. They kill Iranians. They rape Iranian women. They put thousands or tens of thousands of Iranians in jail. So I don't think they're very popular, but they do have a base. It's not as if nobody likes them in Iran. They're just strangers there. They're not. They are part of the Iranian people, and lots of Iranians, especially religious Iranians, like this regime. And they have very strong security forces, the Revolutionary Guard, the Basij, who are quite violent. They're very violent and crush periodic Iranian demonstrations, riots, uprisings, whatever you want to call them. So I don't know if they're going to get rid of the Iranian regime now. Maybe down the road, eventually people will become so disgusted, especially as the Iranian regime, because of its foreign policy, is under sanctions all the time and therefore can't produce money for the Iranian people. So there's no water, there's no electricity at various times of the day. People just can't live without, inflation 50%. Maybe all of this will eventually turn most Iranians against the regime, and then we'll see if they manage to crush these demonstrations or not.
If you had to pick one decision point in 1948 that most changed the trajectory of the war, which is it and why?
Well, there's there are two crucial dates. One is December 1948, when the Palestinian militias began to attack the Jews living in Palestine in the wake of the UN partition resolution of the 29th of November 47. That is, the UN said, let's partition the country into two states. Palestinian militias said no and started shooting at Jews. That was the first major date. If you like, the shooting began a day after the partition resolution on the 30th of November. 1947. And the second date, of course, which is important, is the 15th of May 1948, when five Arab armies, actually it's four, we always say it's five, but it's not five, it's four. Syria's army, Iraq's army, Jordan's army, and the Egyptian army crossed the international border and basically attacked the newborn state of Israel. Those are crucial dates, which meant there was a war from that point on, between the Arab states and the new state of Israel. And those are crucial dates. Subsequently, important dates are what happened in 1949 after the Arabs lost the war and the Arab states signed armistice agreements with Israel. In other words, ending the war. But that's not one date. It's the first armistice agreement was signed in February 49, the last one in July 49. But the crucial dates are the partition resolution by the General Assembly, followed the day after by Palestinians shooting at Jews, launching the war, and then the Arab States Army's invasion of Palestine on the 15th of May 1948. Those are crucial dates, yeah.
So how was Israel so militarily dominant even when it was just newly established as a state?
Well, it wasn't militarily dominant. It worked out. In hindsight, the Israelis were stronger, but the Israelis didn't know that they were stronger.
Mhm.
They probably knew they weren't Israelis yet. They were Zionist settlers. They in 1947, when confronted by the possibility of attack by their Palestinian neighbors, the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, thought they were stronger than the Palestinians. They weren't sure that they would be able to beat the Arab states should the Arab states enter the war and attack Israel. Why were they stronger than the Palestinians, and why did they believe they would beat the Palestinian militias, even though the Palestinians outnumbered the Jews in Palestine by 2-1? There were twice as many Palestinian Arabs as Jews in Palestine. But the Jews were better organized. The Jews were better educated. They had a national militia called the Haganah. National meaning it had a general command. It was unified. They had branches in each town, in each area, and so on. The Palestinians never were able to put together a national militia. They had separate militias, 800 villages with 800 little militias, 50 men here, 70 men there, etc. So a united force fighting against a dispersed collection of militias with poor equipment, the Jews felt they would win, and this was true. They did win once they went over to the offensive. Um, Arab states was a different matter. The Jews didn't know how strong the Arab armies would be, how resolute they would be, how well equipped or under equipped they would be. But it worked out that the Jews had prepared themselves well enough to beat the Arab armies as well, basically. There's also a strong matter of motivation. The Palestinians living in Palestine, if they fight the Jews and lose, they go back to their villages or go to the West Bank or go to the Gaza Strip or go to Jordan or go to Lebanon or go to Syria. They have somewhere to go to. The Jews, if they lose the war in Palestine, have only the Mediterranean to jump into. They don't have anywhere to go. Nobody wants them anywhere. They just got out of Europe, where millions of people, many Europeans had killed millions of Jews. They weren't welcome anywhere. Nobody wanted Jews anywhere. So the Jews had a high motivation in the war, both, as I say, because they had nowhere to go and because they had their families just behind them. We're talking about a very small country. You're fighting on the border of what's called today the West Bank in Israel. It's about 10 miles from Tel Aviv. It's 10 miles from where their families are. So you have to defend your families, and you have nowhere to go, as I say, nowhere to escape to. And it was after the Holocaust, so they feared the Arabs also would massacre them all. Nobody knew that they would. Nobody knew how they would behave. But the assumption after the Holocaust, 2 years after the Holocaust, the Arabs would kill us all because they said they wanted to kill us all. So the sense was that we have to fight for our lives and we have to fight well. So motivation is very important. One last thing, which usually people don't know or forget, is the Jews had much more money. Not because the Jews in Palestine were rich. They weren't. They were basically farmers, just like the Arabs. But they had the Jewish communities around the world who sent them money. So the Jews during the war got something like somewhere between 100 million and 150 million dollars, which was a lot of money then. It's like billions of dollars today, which made them able to run a war and an economy at the same time and to buy arms, ammunition, etc. And the Arab states were basically poor. The few Arab states which were rich didn't give money to the Arab states which were poor, who were busy doing the fighting. The Egyptians, the Syrians, the Jordanians were poor countries. The Saudis, who maybe were rich, they weren't as rich as today, but they just weren't very generous. They didn't give the Arab states real money. So the Arabs didn't have money to buy munitions, to buy arms in the course of the war, and gradually their armaments were depleted. And this meant that the Jews, by the end of the war, had more arms than all the Arab states together. So that's also important.
Hmm. So, as somebody living in Israel, what's the sentiment towards Netanyahu? Do most people like him
Towards
or?
Netanyahu.
Mhm.
Well, now you've raised the red flag. People like myself hate Netanyahu. We think
Okay.
he's incompetent. We think he's a very corrupt politician. He's completely dishonest. He's a serial liar. He's even worse than Trump in this sense.
Mhm.
Um, 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 can't be trusted with anything. The only thing he wants is to retain power, and this mainly because he's on trial for corruption and knows that if he loses power, he will end up in jail because the court will probably find him guilty and send him to jail. And this is what haunts his nights. He knows that he loses power, he ends up in. So he'll do everything to remain in power, cheat, lie, um, um, do everything he can to maintain power. And he relies on his right wing and religious coalition partners to maintain power. He has 68 votes in the Israeli Knesset out of 120 because he has his party plus all these religious and ultra right wing parties in his, and he has to hold them together. So he gives them all of what they want in order to get their support, retain their support, and maintain a hold on power. Um, the guy's a total schmuck. That's the way I would put it very simply. And most Israelis by now understand this. And if there were elections today, I'm sure he would lose, and he knows he would lose, even though he has a base of support, just like Trump has a base of support. Maybe Trump has a better base of support, but most Israelis by this stage are opposed to Netanyahu continuing as prime minister.
Hmm. So regarding the religious extremists, I was talking with Professor Lustig, and he was telling me how he thinks these people are planning to kill all the Palestinians, and then hopefully the Messiah comes back in a religious
No,
quest.
I think that's an exaggeration. I don't think they're thinking of killing all the Palestinians. I would say that at the back of their minds, and they don't say that, at least the right-wing nationalist religious people, at the back of their minds, they probably want to expel the Palestinians from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem to make the Judaize the land, if you like. I don't think they're thinking in terms of a genocide or killing all the Palestinians. I think that's a vast exaggeration. But I think they would like the country to be populated only by Jews and gradually to push out the Palestinians. These are the ultra right wing national religious people.
Mhm.
This is
So,
true, yeah.
so all the
But
time,
they're not in control of policy at the moment. They're in the coalition. They're very important for the maintenance of the coalition. But policy is really determined by Netanyahu and his Likud cronies.
Mhm. So the Israel lobby in America has gotten very famous recently, and lots of people are against it. There's many mixed messages. What do you think about it?
The Israel lobby, the pro-Zionist lobby was always very strong in America. This war has sort of changed public opinion to some extent in America. I don't think it's changed as much as a lot of people think, because you see all these demonstrations on campuses and you think, well, all Americans have turned against Israel. I don't think that's true. I think Americans of Muslim origin are anti-Israeli. I think a lot of youngsters in the campuses have joined them. This is fashionable and they've become anti-Israeli. I don't think most Americans prefer Palestinians or Palestine over Israel. I think most Americans still think Israel is a democracy, which it still is, but just about, because Netanyahu is busy trying to destroy Israeli democracy. But it remains a democracy at the moment and has shares common values with most Americans. But a lot of support has been undermined by this war in Gaza, which was a terrible war, which exacted tens of thousands of Arabs killed as a result of the nature of the war.
Hmm. So do you think most of the critiques can be prescribed to Netanyahu's actions specifically, or just general Zionist actions? Does that make sense?
I think Israel's position in the world has declined steadily since 1967, since Israel conquered the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and occupied these areas with military government, often using distasteful methods to govern a foreign people. They don't have rights. They can't move about freely. A lot of them are imprisoned for rioting or even what they think. This happens also. Um, um, so Israel steadily has been losing support because of its policy of occupation in the territories. I think Netanyahu, being the leader of Israel for the past 20 odd years, has also undermined Israel's position in the world because people understand that the man is corrupt and malicious and a nasty piece of work altogether, and certainly not somebody who wants to reach a compromise with the Arabs. So this has also undermined Israel's position. But on top of that, you've got this war of the past 2 years, which has eaten away at Israeli support of Israel because of the vast numbers of casualties and the way the war has been waged. I'm not sure there was much choice in how to wage the war once the Palestinians of Gaza attacked Israel and Israel launched a counteroffensive. I don't know how differently it would have been managed by somebody else, but it's certainly been managed incompetently and has caused vast numbers of civilian casualties among the Palestinians.
Mhm. What do you think audiences miss about the internal debates among Jewish or Yishuv leadership during the war?
What do you mean?
In terms of what do you think, there's a lot of discussion regarding a specific topic or idea within the government, except lots of people in the public don't necessarily even know about it. Is that a, or maybe there's no
Well, I
nothing.
don't know how much divisiveness, how much difference of opinion there is inside the government. There is a division and criticism of the government from outside the government, from what I would say is probably the majority of the population today and the opposition parties. they're very opposed to lots of things. But again, it's not that basic a division in the sense of how to conduct the war. I don't think anybody's come up with a better way of conducting this war. Now, thankfully, the war seems to be over. But I don't know if anybody had a really good idea of how to do it differently so that there would be less Arab casualties, etc. But on the other hand, there was tremendous criticism of the government because of Netanyahu for his policies trying to undermine Israeli democracy and the standing of the Israeli judiciary. He began to attack the judiciary the moment he was put on trial for corruption. He knew his life was in the hands of the judges, and therefore he said the judges are all dishonest. That's essentially what he's doing. And a lot of Israelis bought this. It's obvious nonsense, but that's he's quite a persuasive speaker and a very manipulative, clever politician, Netanyahu. And so his base continues to believe that he's right and the judiciary and the opposition are wrong.
Mhm. So, what's the strongest or most common argument against your interpretation of 1948, and what's your response to the critics?
I don't know. I think everybody accepts what I write.
Mhm. Okay.
No, I'm being seriously. I don't think there's serious criticism of my findings about 1948, not about the causes of the creation of the refugee problem, not about the way the war was handled and fought, etc. I don't think there is much criticism. That's why I think my books are taught in campuses around the world.
Mhm. So,
Initially, a lot of Israelis opposed what I wrote because it seemed to undermine the Zionist narrative. But eventually, I think they came around to understanding that what I'd written was based on documentation, was factual, was real, and they came to accept it reluctantly, not reluctantly. And I think that's the situation. I may be exaggerating my popularity.
Um, how do you personally separate historical description from moral judgment when writing about atrocities and civilian harm?
Say that again.
Personally separate historical description from moral judgment in terms of you're just like
Okay, well,
strictly.
this is a problem. Most people have a moral compass, if you like, and let it rule the way they look at history as well. I try to separate the two. I have a moral compass. I believe one shouldn't go around massacring people or raping people. I think people should try and behave honestly. But when I look at things in history, like 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and I look at the documentation which tells me what happened then, I think I sort of try and separate my own prejudices, my own beliefs, my own moral compass from what I see, and I say these are the facts as dictated by the documentation. And I say as wide documentation as you can find about certain events, certain people, certain processes, and so on. But it is a problem. Lots of people have a real problem in separating facts and from their moral judgments and which underlie their political views about today. In other words, they have political views about what's happening now, and they say, well, if this is what's happening now, this is what was happening in 1948, and what I think is right, and therefore what was happening then was wrong on one side or the other. Some historians at least, that's how they view the past through the lens of contemporary politics and morality, and that's wrong. That's not the way you should look at history. You should try and separate yourself completely from the things you are trying to investigate and reach conclusions about.
Is that to get more objective conclusions or?
Well, I think they're objective, but some people will say no. That guy says he's objective, but underlying what he says is objective are also his moral judgments and his political views. But I don't think that's true, in my case at least, but maybe I don't see it right.
So why do you choose to focus on specific towns or villages as opposed to just only macro scale?
No, that's not true. My books, if you look at them, deal with the macro. But in
Uh,
order to substantiate the macro, you have to look at what happened in lots of little places, and then you build a picture of what actually happened on the large scale on macro. That's how I built the macro pictures. And they do exist. You look at the conclusions of my books. Don't read the books. Read the concluding chapters. That'll give you the macro of what happened, say, in 1948.
mhm. So you have a lot of books behind you. What if you were to recommend three books to our audience and myself, what do you think?
Well, if you want something really complicated, very detailed, but very substantial, something which will last, I believe is a book on the bookshelf in 100 years' time, I would look at The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited. It's quite long. It's like 700 pages long, very detailed, but that gives you the true picture of how the refugee problem was created in 1948. That's one book. If you want something lighter, and it's not light at all, read my book 1948, A History of the First Arab-Israeli War. I think it's shorter, it's 400 pages or something, but and that's also not short, but it's people tell me it's very readable and it's a good general survey of the war, 1948. And a third book, since you said I should say three, a third book would be Righteous Victims, which is a history of the whole conflict from 1882 until more or less the year 2000, a book called Righteous Victims. That's it's also long, but it's a general overview of the whole conflict.
So when you write these super long, dense books,
They're
how
not
how
all
long
super. They're not all super long, and they're not all super dense.
Mhm. When you write some super long, dense books, how long does that take between research and writing and planning? How do you go about that?
Generally, I find that writing a book takes 3 years.
Uh-huh.
Most books take 3 years. I've written a book in 1 year or 1.5 years, a short book, my most recent book, in fact. Um, but the book Righteous Victims, which is like 700 pages long, I think it took me something like 5 or 6 years to write. And I wrote a book about the Turkish Muslim genocide against the Christians in Turkey. I wrote it with somebody else. It's also a long book, and that book took me and this other person, Professor Dror Zeevi, took us all together about 8 years to write. So it's a long book. It's probably dense, as you would call it, but that took a long time. In other words, it depends on what you're really researching, how many archives you have to get to, how many documents you have to read through, and then how you manage to bring it all together. Bring it all together.
Hmm. So typically I start the interviews sort of biographically, but I guess I forgot to. So why did you originally get interested and decide to pursue the Israel-Palestine conflict as your profession?
Well, it's sort of an accident. Um, I I did my BA in Israel and I did a PhD in England in Cambridge, and I intended to write a PhD on Cromwell's army. And I don't know if you know who Cromwell was. You might have encountered that name in street names in England. Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell was one of the rebels who overthrew the monarchy in the 1640s in England, and he created an army which won the wars against the royalists. And so I was going to write a PhD on that 17th century British army. But when I got to England, I found that the guy they'd given me as a supervisor in Cambridge, um, I didn't appreciate him, and I decided to switch to 20th century history. So I did something about a PhD on Anglo-German relations in the 1930s, nothing to do with the Middle East. And then when I came back to Israel and I found a job in journalism, I decided I want to write a book. And I looked about and I found that the documentation and things which were available in Israel to write about were things to do with Israel and the Arabs. And that's how I ended up writing about Israel and the Palestinians and eventually about Israel and the Arab world and so on. So it was sort of an accident. I wasn't trained as a Middle East historian, but I ended up writing Middle East history.
Hmm. So the last question that I ask all of the interviewees is, how do you define success personally and professionally? Sort of big question.
I don't know. Firstly, I think you should be able to make a living. In other words, you should be able to live and maintain your family with a Rolls Royce, of course, preferably. That's a measure of success. Some people don't manage that. Lots of people who do PhDs in America end up not working in universities. There's no jobs, and that's lack of success if you want to become an academic. So one thing is you should be able to live properly so that you can, with your mind free to do what it wants academically. Secondly, success should be measured among historians by the impact their books have on the way people think about the past. In other words, if you write books which have some sort of impact about the past, say about 1948 or about the Israeli-Arab conflict, it persuades people, what he's writing is correct, and this is the way we should really look at how things happened. That's success as well. A lot of historians write books, nobody pays attention, they end up on library shelves and nobody reads them, and I think that's lack of success. Even if they do manage to get the Rolls Royce, it's not real success professionally. That's a problem also. Um, and I think that it's success is also not just your impact, the book's impact, or your thinking about the past's impact on present thinking, but also um, do people are they persuaded by your arguments? In other words, they may be persuaded initially, but does this persuasion last long? In other words, does it continue to work? In other words, a long persuasion, not just short persuasion. That's a good idea. That's persuasion for the next 5 minutes. Persuasion for 20, 30, 40 years means people are still reading your books, or at least taking into account what you've said and written 20, 40 years hence. And that's success for an historian. For a jeweler, success is measured in different terms.
Mhm. Makes sense. Thank you so much for your time. There's so many. Maybe let's say 80% of the people I've interviewed, the last 40 people I've interviewed might have been Jewish. So Jewish people obviously are incredibly successful in America. So it's very interesting to talk and learn more about Israel Palestine as a whole. And thank you so much for your time. Obviously, as a huge figure
My,
in the space.
my pleasure. My pleasure.
So I'll do some more. So originally I learned about you with through Lex Friedman, who you obviously know as you were there. Um, so now I'll do more research with the book recommendations you gave, and I'll follow up with that, and then I'll also send you the edited interview when it's all done.
Okay, fine. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.